Shabbat Shalom. This is kind of an auspicious Shabbat because it was 20 years ago this week that I moved into my office here at Temple Beth Shalom. My predecessor, I'm cutting in and out. Is that better? Is that better? Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. 20 years ago, I started moving into my office. My predecessor, Rabbi Fred Raskin, had departed a bit early, so I got to start moving in. There were, unfortunately, a couple of deaths in the community, and so I just jumped in to help out. What did I know? I was 27. I wasn't even 28 yet. And at the time, I was the father of one. What did I know about life? I knew everything. I swear. So here I am, 20 years later, and I don't think 20 years later I would have imagined that I am a star of television, video, and microphones, but it's pretty cool. And I stand before you on the Shabbat, and earlier today, was talking with someone who's also a gardener, and I had to tell her about my big fame as a gardener. Some of you that have been around since 2012 know about the Wall Street Journal article. And you see in 2012, a wonderful writer, her name is Lucette Lanyada. She wrote a beautiful memoir about her father called The Man in the White Sharkskin Suit. She happened to be visiting and coming through Vero. And I said to her, I started taking her on a tour of the garden. And all of you know that you've spent time at Temple Beth Shalom. My ideas and my chutzpah might outstrip my ability to keep up with everything. It was December or January, something like that, and the garden was not in great shape. Moreover, we hadn't had a whole lot of success with the garden. I got a couple of grapes. I got a pomegranate. I think we got 3 olives. I could have more fingers than the amount of produce that had come from the garden at that point. So I shared with her my dreams, not my success. You can read dreams as failures up until that point. She said that would be a great article for the Wall Street Journal. And I said, sure, I'm not going to stay. What do I know? It's 2012. It's 10 years ago, right? What do I know? I'm in my 30s. I've got some kids. I've got quite a lovely congregation. Wall Street Journal, that's so cool. Goes on for a little bit, and she says front page, but I'm assuming front page of the human interest stories, right? Makes sense. Where else do you put garden stories? Not on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, right? I still have it. I was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. I was declared the Job of biblical gardening, meaning everything I touched was going to disaster. And she happily enumerated all of the garden's failures I had had up until that point, and even got a quote from another biblical garden person who said, I sure hope that guy isn't trying to feed anyone. If he could only taste my challah now. I share that. Think about that. I was a failure, and I got on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The plants didn't do well, but no humans died. No one went to jail, and it's pretty awesome to do that and succeed, right? I honestly feel like that's kind of like our Torah portion tonight. We're in Matot Maasei. We're at the very end of the book of Numbers. Now, if you look at the rest of the book of Numbers, it looks more like what I just said. People die, people go to jail, right? You have the failed spies in Shlach Lecha, where 12 spies or scouts go in the land, and they come back with this big haul of produce, and 10 of them are like, oh, days mir, and they're grasshoppers and crushed and awful, and we're doomed. And 2 of them say, yeah, we can do it. Well, the 10 went out, and they wandered around for 38 years. And there's Korach and his band, and they're like, Moses, you can't. And Moses says, I can. And you're not good enough, and we're holy too. And they battle back and forth, and they're fire pans, and the earth opens up, and 250, and then more die, right? you got plagues, you have endless wandering in the wilderness. There are bitter waters, there's sibling fights. Miriam gets Sara'at, she gets leprosy and banned for a week. It is one disaster after another. It is one problem, they might take one step forward or two steps towards the promised land, but it's one step back and it's ugly. And yet in this week's Torah portion, there are all of these moments of challenge and disagreement, but even with the challenge and disagreement, even with it being very much the same flavor of Numbers, no one dies, no one gets banished from the community, and the people of Israel are actually able to move forward. It's actually quite extraordinary. So many of you probably have heard the story of Zelophehad's daughters. A few chapters ago, they have come forward to Moses and the people of Israel. They said, look, our dad has no sons. According to the laws you have set up, if dad has no sons, then we lose our land and we lose our legacy. Let us inherit. They go through this step, and then there's now arguments again that maybe they shouldn't inherit, or maybe it's their husbands. There is this whole, again, debate that goes on about inheritance, about property rights, about how things are passed from generation to generation. There's another disagreement that happens. Some of the tribes, Reuven, Gad, parts of Manasseh, come forward and they say, look, we like the east side of the Jordan River. It's great for grazing. There's plenty of land to step out. We're going to stop here if that's okay, Moses. And Moses is like, no, you can't do that. We've all got to go in the land. And there's a whole debate, discussion, argument going back and forth of what's the responsibility of the community. If you find a good landing spot, do you stop in New York or do you go all the way to San Francisco? And they have this discussion and debate, and you see the tension in the community. And finally, and this is one that I've seen but I didn't quite realize, something extraordinary happens. In this section of the book of Numbers, you get the laying out of the borders of the land of Israel, of the promised land, what the ancestors, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, what they're going to inherit. And the borders get laid out. Just like a few chapters later in Deuteronomy, different borders get laid out. Between Numbers and Deuteronomy, you have a disagreement about, wait, where are the borders going to be? Through this Torah portion, these set of Torah portions, Parshiot, you see debate, disagreement, argument. It's the same stuff on some level you see all through the book of Numbers, and yet there's an interesting difference. There is something really important for us to see, to hear, to witness, to carry around with us. Because even as Zelophehad's daughters come forward, and then the opponents of Zelophehad's daughters come forward, even as these tribes come forward and they're debating and arguing and they're saying, we want to stay here, we're not ready to go forward, we'll send some of our troops forward, but we want to stay here. As you see this disagreement that you could say, why is Numbers not agreeing with Deuteronomy? You see different responses to conflict. This is going to come as a shock, but humans don't always get along. Have you ever heard that there are 2 Jews and 3 opinions? Right? We say it all the time, and yet I don't think that we stop and say, well, wait a second, if there are 2 Jews and 3 opinions, you can usually only go with one opinion at a time. How do we figure out which opinion to follow? Because even if we have opinions, you can still only go in one direction at a time. Hillel. Thank you. As Cantor says, Hillel, which is part of one part of the answer. Some of you have tried, I know I have, to try to go to two directions at once, but that usually ends up with major joint repairs. Right? I look out to my congregation. How many hips, knees, ankles, shoulders do we have out in the congregation, right? How many of us have been walkers, wheelchairs, crutches, the cool wheelie things? 3 Jews, 2 opinions is conflict, and yet how do we settle those conflicts? because there are real challenges between the parties, and if they don't settle this, if they don't figure out the inheritance and property rights, if you don't figure out where the borders are going to be, if you don't figure out where the community is going and how and who's responsible for moving forward, you're going to have a real impact on the fabric of life. You're going to have real tension and real battles, which we see all over Numbers. Now, a couple of things happen which are quite extraordinary. One of them is that they call on God. They want God to settle it. Sometimes that works, right? I'll call it the flip of a coin. Sometimes you ask for God, there's a divine voice, there's a sign, you flip a coin and go with the odds. But there's a lot of other moments where the humans in this parsha have to come up with solutions. Now, I'm going to tell you some of the solutions they come up with, but I want to stop for a second because I also want us, you can't just carry around the solutions. I think we also have to carry around the fears. Because I think the fears, the worries, the concerns that we bring when we stand in conflict, not because in disagreement, and I don't mean like conflict, we're going to war with each other, but when we have those differences of opinion, when we have 2 Jews and 3 opinions, when we have 2 political parties and how many different opinions, as we have this stuff, part of it is to realize what are we thinking about, what do we feel in those moments? Think about the fear for a minute. The fear that you might be right and the other side doesn't listen. The fear that they might be right and you might be wrong. The fear that you might get pulled into a direction that you're not comfortable with or isn't going to get you where you want to be. The fear that if you follow in or give in or let some your plans, your carefully laid plans, are going to go awry. One that we see in Israel all the time, that you're going to give up your space. That if you give an inch, the other guy's going to take a mile. I've got to stick to my guns. You can listen to the language. I've got to stick with my opinion. I've got to stick with my way of doing things, because if I change my way of doing things, if I give up space, the other guy's going to win. Those are all real concerns. We all do it. Sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, and you see it. And Zelophehad's daughters, they're worried that if the daughters get inheritance, then somehow the men are going to lose out. You see it with the tribes staying on the east side where Moses is like, wait a second, how can you abandon us? We're going to need everybody. If we don't get everybody, we won't get there. You can see it with those borders of, wait, if I'm on this hill and not that hill, maybe I'll lose water. Maybe I'll lose resources. Maybe the enemies will be closer. You can see all of those pushes and pulls and that fear. And when we stand in, and I call it opposition or disagreement or conflict with other people, I think we have to weigh that yetzer hara, that negative stuff that can weigh us down. And yet, if we want to be humanity together, if we really want to create shalom, if the people of Israel are really going to get to the promised land, you have to find, even with 3 Jews and 2 opinions, a way to move forward. And that is where Matot Maasei is so extraordinary. What do you see them do? You see them pause to listen. In multiple stories, there's one point where Moses goes and he sleeps on it. There's another point where everybody stops to listen to each other's side. In fact, as Cantor is calling out, who do we follow? And she says, Hillel. The Hillel Shammai debates, why do we follow Hillel? This tradition says, because he listened, stopped, and let Shammai go first, and listened, and always honored Shammai's opinion. They were space given to feel and comprehend each other, your own fears and worries and rationale, whether irrational. There was that ability to step back and focus and see what's important. And the most important one of all of this is knowing that there is sometimes when you just have to give. You have to follow someone else's way. That there's times when you have to compromise. There's a beautiful example. What direction do our mezuzot hang? Right? Jane's going like this. So the argument is, do you hang your mezuzah straight up or horizontal? Why straight up? Because you want it to point to heaven. Why horizontal? Because you want it to lay like the Torah did in the Ark of the Covenant. And how do ours go?
Halfway.
Because it's neither all the way up or all the way down. That ability to compromise, to find that halfway point. And then there's also those moments where you have to stand firm. And we see that with Ruvain and Gad and Manasseh. They do stand firm. They say, you know what, we're going to stay here, but don't worry, we've still got your back. We're going to send troops. We're going to send support. We are not abandoning the people of Israel. We're going to adjust and change to get where we need to be. It is a tall order. And it's not like you walk around with this book, with this chapter and these words in your hands, and yet I want to plant those seeds. Those seeds of those moments where in this conflict, when they come forward, when the opponents of Zelophehad's daughters and Zelophehad's daughters come forward and they listen to each other back and forth and ask God's opinion. When you have this dispute over who gets to stay where, they go and they sleep on it. When you see these borders, there's negotiations and back and forth, and you find those middle grounds. Let us, as we are watching this, as we are seeing so many disasters earlier in the book of Numbers, where people were at each other's throats, people were doing blame, people couldn't resolve conflicts without getting in combat with each other. Let us see even these moments where everything doesn't go perfectly. Just like in my garden, everything didn't go perfectly, and yet it was still a beautiful story to tell and still full of joy and life. That's what this end of the book of Numbers, right before the book of Deuteronomy, is. Because when we find those moments of human conflict and disagreement, as we wrestle back and forth, we do see these incredible stories that remind us of how to be human and yet how to be a beautiful community living in shalom. Amen?
Amen.
Shabbat shalom.